We begin not in a theater of history books or Hollywood sets, but in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, cold, endless, and silent. Beneath these waters lies the most haunting monument ever built by human hands. The world knows her name, Titanic. For more than a century, her story has been told as a noble tragedy, a tale of heroism and heartbreak frozen in time. But what if that story was never the truth? What if the ship that symbolized human achievement was, in reality, doomed long before she ever left port? The truth begins not in 1912, but in 1985, with a man named Robert Ballard. Ballard wasn't just another explorer, he was a scientist possessed by obsession. Born in 1942, raised near the sea, and trained by the U.S. Navy, he learned how to navigate the hidden world beneath the waves. While others dreamed of glory and command, Ballard's dream was simpler, and far more ambitious. He wanted to uncover the ocean's buried secrets. During the Cold War, he became a pioneer in underwater robotics, developing remotely operated vehicles capable of surviving pressures that would crush any diver. These machines became his eyes in the abyss. But there was one mystery that consumed him above all others: the Titanic. A ship declared unsinkable, built to represent progress, luxury, and human dominance over nature. Yet within 4 short days of her maiden voyage, she struck an iceberg and disappeared into the deep, dragging over 1,500 lives with her. For 73 years, her resting place remained hidden. Myths flourished. Some called her a victim of fate, others, a cautionary tale about arrogance. To Ballard, that wasn't enough. He wanted evidence. He wanted truth. In the summer of 1985, after years of failed attempts, Ballard's team descended 2.5 miles into the North Atlantic. Cameras slid silently through the black water. And then, out of that void, something began to appear, an outline so iconic that Ballard and his crew fell into stunned silence. The bow of the Titanic, half buried in sediment, materialized like a ghost rising from its grave. Her rails were twisted but recognizable, her anchor chains still in place, her name faintly visible beneath decades of corrosion. The world above celebrated discovery. Ballard, however, saw something else. What he found that day would change history, and haunt him for the rest of his life. When Ballard's cameras glided through the wreckage, they found not just a ship, but a cemetery. Shoes, still in pairs, where bodies once lay. Suitcases split open, their contents scattered across the seabed. A woman's brooch, a child's toy, fragments of clothing drifting gently in the current. These were not artifacts. They were echoes of lives interrupted. Ballard called it a grave, and insisted it should never be disturbed. Yet the more he looked, the more he realized Titanic wasn't just a memorial, it was evidence. Something about the wreck didn't match the story history had told. Survivors had long described Titanic sinking intact, sliding gracefully beneath the surface. But Ballard saw 2 halves of a ship lying almost 2,000 feet apart. The Titanic hadn't gone down whole. She had torn herself apart in a violent explosion of steel and pressure. That was the first crack in the legend. When engineers analyzed the footage, they saw more than tragedy, they saw flaws. Rivets that had popped loose like buttons under strain. Steel plates peeled back like paper. Metallurgists later confirmed what Ballard's footage implied: Titanic's rivets were made from inferior wrought iron, prone to snapping in extreme cold. Even the steel itself, hailed as the strongest ever used in shipbuilding, turned brittle in freezing temperatures. The unsinkable ship had been built with the seeds of its own destruction. Every plate, every joint, whispered the same truth: Titanic was doomed before she ever set sail. The more Ballard studied the evidence, the clearer the pattern became. Titanic's downfall wasn't a single unlucky collision, it was the product of arrogance, negligence, and greed. The White Star Line, desperate to outshine its rival Cunard, rushed construction. Cost-saving measures replaced quality rivets with cheaper ones in critical sections of the hull. Even worse, company executives insisted that too many lifeboats would clutter the decks and spoil the luxury image. So they installed only enough to save half the passengers, by design. And then there were the ignored warnings. Multiple ships had sent messages that night about ice ahead, yet Titanic's wireless operators, overwhelmed with telegrams from wealthy passengers, brushed them aside. The radio room was working overtime transmitting dinner invitations instead of danger signals. When the iceberg appeared, it was too late. Ballard's footage, when analyzed with survivor accounts, painted a chilling picture. Titanic wasn't felled by an iceberg, it was betrayed by human pride. The tragedy was preventable, and that made it unforgivable. As Ballard examined the lifeboat davits, some still upright, untouched, he saw symbols of decisions made in boardrooms that cost over 1,000 lives. What looked like rusted machinery were, to him, the fingerprints of negligence. When Ballard returned to the surface, he expected his findings to rewrite history. He imagined the world confronting the hard truth, that Titanic's loss was a man-made catastrophe, not a noble act of fate. Instead, the opposite happened. The media focused on romance and sentiment. Newspapers published haunting photos of the wreck, calling it a ghost frozen in time. Filmmakers spun stories of doomed lovers and heroic captains. The truth was buried again, beneath a mountain of nostalgia. Why? Because the myth was profitable. A story of hubris and heartbreak sells tickets, fills museums, and inspires movies. A story of corporate shortcuts and deadly greed does not. Governments, too, preferred silence. After all, courts had already absolved the White Star Line decades earlier, limiting their liability to a fraction of the real cost. Acknowledging new evidence would have reopened legal wounds, and perhaps exposed collusion between regulators and company officials. It was easier for everyone to keep the Titanic as legend, not litigation. Even Ballard's own expedition had secrets. Officially, it was a scientific mission funded by research grants. In truth, much of the money came from the U.S. Navy, which used Ballard's Titanic search as cover for locating 2 sunken nuclear submarines. The Titanic was a perfect distraction, grand, emotional, and apolitical. But that overlap between science and secrecy led many to wonder, if the expedition itself had hidden motives, what else might have been concealed? Rumors began to swirl. Some claimed that Ballard's team had discovered objects never shown to the public, containers, documents, maybe even personal effects quietly removed before cameras rolled. Others revived an old theory, that the ship on the seabed might not be Titanic at all, but her nearly identical sister ship, Olympic, swapped in an insurance scheme gone wrong. Ballard never endorsed the theory, but his discovery that official accounts of the sinking were wrong gave the story oxygen. If officials had lied about how the ship broke apart, people wondered, what else had they lied about? While none of these conspiracies were ever proven, one thing was certain, the world preferred illusion to truth. Ballard's revelations about poor construction and ignored warnings were quietly minimized. The heroism remained, the guilt was forgotten. In public interviews, Ballard spoke carefully. He called the site sacred, avoided speculation, and said little about blame. But in private, he admitted something heavier, that what he'd seen beneath the sea was darker than anyone had been told. Imagine descending through absolute blackness, knowing you are the first human being to look upon one of history's greatest tombs. Imagine seeing a shoe resting next to another, exactly where 2 people once stood before the ship broke apart. For Ballard, each artifact was a sentence in a story written by steel and silence. Titanic wasn't just a lost ship, it was a mirror, reflecting the arrogance of an age that believed technology made it invincible. When he examined the hull, Ballard noticed something else. The iceberg hadn't carved a massive gash as early reports had claimed. Instead, it caused seams between plates to pop open, allowing seawater to pour in through narrow cracks. Titanic didn't lose a battle to nature, it collapsed under its own flaws. Every snapped rivet was a confession of the choices made to save money and cut corners. The implications were devastating. If this evidence had been known in 1912, the world would not have seen Titanic as a tragedy of fate, but as an indictment of human greed. Families might have won justice. shipbuilding might have changed sooner. Instead, the myth triumphed, and the truth drowned. As the years passed, Ballard became a symbol of discovery, the man who found Titanic. But the legend weighed heavily on him. The images that made him famous were the same ones that buried his message. He wanted the world to see what he saw, that Titanic sinking wasn't just about nature's power, it was about our own carelessness. Yet the public clung to romance. Every time a movie was made, every time a tour company sold souvenirs, the legend grew stronger and the truth sank deeper. Even the scientific community, while acknowledging metallurgical flaws, avoided calling it negligence. For Ballard, that was the unspoken confession. He knew the ship was a crime scene, but the world had chosen to build a shrine instead of a courtroom. Still, questions linger. Did Ballard hold back evidence to protect the sanctity of the grave site? Did he withhold images under pressure from sponsors or governments? He never said. And perhaps he never will. But one fact remains beyond dispute: the wreck itself, split, shattered, scarred, is the ultimate witness. Today, Robert Ballard is an old man. The sea that defined his life still guards its secrets, but he has begun to speak with more candor. He calls Titanic a warning, a symbol of human arrogance repeating itself across generations. The same overconfidence that sent her into an ice field still exists, in boardrooms, in governments, in every place where profit outweighs precaution. Look closely at Titanic, and you see our reflection. You see how greed disguises itself as ambition, how silence protects the powerful, and how history prefers heroes to accountability. The Titanic story is not locked in 1912, it echoes every time we ignore warnings, cut corners, or tell comforting lies about preventable disasters. 2 miles beneath the waves, the ship still lies broken, her bow pointing upward, her stern twisted apart. The ocean has claimed her, but her message endures. Every rivet, every crack, every forgotten shoe whispers the same words: arrogance sinks ships. Greed destroys lives. Truth never stays buried forever.